The following is a conversation that I had with Dr. Seumas Macdonald about his journey in learning classical and Koine Greek, as well as comprehensible input-based teaching and learning methods. I wanted to hear his story because I thought it would be full of things that could help me with my own endeavors to go deeper into Greek, and I wasn't disappointed. He also offered some great advice for Greek learners who want to move on from a beginner or intermediate level into more challenging classical and Koine texts. Seumas is a Greek and Latin teacher who runs the Patrologist.com. He has a PhD in patristics and is also an active contributor to the CI community. He's working on some really exciting projects, so I hope you enjoy listening to our conversation and are inspired in your own Greek journey. Well, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for...
My pleasure.
So I was thinking about where I am in my own Greek skills. Thinking about, obviously you're much farther than I am, and I've thought, well, how do you get from, where I am, which I think is an advanced beginner, low intermediate, to where you are?
Wherever that is.
And as I was thinking about it, I was like, the story of how you got from from zero to where you are could be really helpful for people like me who are trying to figure out how do we do the CI kind of thing and all that.
Yeah.
So.
Yes. And as I was thinking about it the last couple of days, part of the story of how I got from wherever I was to wherever I am, is realizing that I could have got here a lot quicker and better if I'd been more aware from the start of what was necessary. It's taken me a lot longer to get where I am than it should take someone. Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
So how did you get started in Greek? Where was day one?
Day one was probably about 20-ish years ago. I was doing some theological study. I was doing some independent theological study with their exams, but there was no teaching. And so I sat down with Mounts, and I worked through Mounts on my own, and I did reasonably well.
Hello.
Passed my exams.
Hey, Katie. No, not right now. I don't know where it is. You need to do something else. This is important. Okay. You have a daughter, right? I think I've heard that on your podcast.
So I started with Mounts. Worked through most of Mounts. Passed some exams. That was the year before it was 2 years before I went to seminary. I also started doing Latin at the same time. And so I got far enough with Mounts on my own that when I got to seminary, Greek was not a particular struggle. I was ahead most of the time. My seminary required 4 years of Greek, in the sense that you had to cover most of a first year grammar in a traditional way in first year. It wasn't Mounts, but it was homebrewed materials. And then in second year, we had to work through Wallace quite rigorously. And then after first year, all the exegesis in New Testament was based on the Greek text. So that's how I got started. I did a lot of work. I was very interested in Greek at the time. I put a lot of time in, and I was doing Latin simultaneously. So I did flashcards back then. I don't tell people to do flashcards these days unless they have to. I think there are better uses of time. But at the same time, I used electronic flashcards to learn probably about 3,000 New Testament vocab words, down to about 3 or 4 frequency. And I just knew the grammar back to front. So that made the reading side of things a lot easier at the time. And because I was also doing Latin, I started to branch off and do a little bit of Attic, some short courses here and there, that kind of thing. I took a college course in Lysias, which is pretty easy transition from Koine. That's how I got started. Yeah.
Okay. So, starting with mounts, I
Hmm.
know the book. That was my introduction to Greek.
Yeah.
Um, so I get that. So electronic flashcards, something like Anki or a similar program
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
learn your vocab, and then just exposure through exegesis classes, and then some extra classes
Yeah.
in the attic
Yeah.
I liked outside of seminary.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, okay, that makes sense. Um, so how did you get from? At what point did you decide? Like, how did you get from there to
Yeah. Then so the next,
PI kind of stuff?
yeah, the next step was really I got to the end of so while I was in seminary because I wasn't busy enough. I was doing a Latin. I wasn't doing a degree, but I was doing a sequence of Latin subjects for a postgraduate diploma. Uh, and so I got to the end of that, and I was a couple of things kind of factored in. It ended up being a 5-year sequence, so because you had to pick up some extra subjects along the way. I got to the end of that, and I was thinking, well, I started reading discussions, kind of mailing lists of Latin teachers and what they were doing, uh, and hearing about some kind of early CI stuff. Then this was around 2006-7, and I discovered Lingua Latina per se illustrata. So I
Mm-hmm.
started reading that, and that kind of led to some kind of light bulb moments where I went, okay, how did I get through 4 or 5 years of Latin and I can't do what a modern language major can do. Like you wouldn't get through a French degree
No.
and not be able to read French fluently and talk about French texts in French. People would think that's ludicrous. So what is different about Latin and Greek? Um, and reading Lingua Latina per se illustrata opened my eyes to say you can teach, you can learn Latin all in Latin. Um, so that kind of put me on a bit of a uh, I mean, I had the same questions about Greek, but Latin was really the thing that was driving my kind of pedagogical shift to say, okay, well, why can't we do this? What is it? What is it that's stopping us? Um, and so I started looking for different materials. I started, I think, yeah. So I picked up Randall Booth's materials at the time from Biblical Language Center. They were helpful. I looked at some of the history of Latin and Greek teaching, so people like Rus and A Greek Boy at Home, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Tried to figure. I mean, that's not an easy book, I have to say.
No.
um, certainly not where I would start someone.
I sort of feel like after we get done with that, I want to work on a Greek toddler at home.
Yeah, yeah. Do you see? Yeah, you see the things that he has in chapter 1 and 2. I'm like, these are. Anyway,
Yeah.
um, so that kind of stuff helped to shift my thinking, and particularly listening to Latin teachers and what they were starting to do at the time. People like Bob Patrick and John Piazza were kind of voices for that, and so it became a bit of a process of, okay, you need to cobble together whatever you can, but it was also a shift in mindset to say, okay, translation is not the game. Reading a text as it is in the language is the game. Uh, so I shifted the way I tried to think about languages. That
Mhm.
that that was part of the process. Um, post post my first seminary degree, I went on to do some further classics subjects as part of a kind of a graduate certificate, and I started a master's of theology. So that's meant that I was doing more reading, a lot more reading. And I was involved in kind of some summer courses, winter courses, these kinds of things. So there was kind of an ongoing kind of exposure to texts. And particularly my master's ended up with me writing a thesis on Chrysostom.
Oh,
So I was reading Chrysostom's sermons and working through them, or some of them in Greek. And then I mean, it was kind of a really, it's kind of a long process that went up and down, but depending on what else was going on in life and how much time languages could have. Um, there clearly were other people doing things. This was kind of 2009, 10, that kind of period.
Mhm.
But there wasn't that much happening kind of internationally, and particularly I think the communications that we have kind of now between people doing things in different parts of the world just wasn't as developed back then.
Yeah.
So I knew about Booth, but I didn't know about many other people doing communicative type of things. Then in 2012, I think it was 12, we moved to Mongolia, where I was working for 3 years. The first year I was in full-time language study, and so
Right.
I was learning Mongolian 5 to 6 hours a day, one-on-one with tutors. And by that stage, I'd also done a lot of reading in second language acquisition. So I had a kind of a much stronger linguistic basis to say, okay, this is how language acquisition takes place. And so even though I wasn't driving those sessions, I kind of had a much clearer idea of what should drive language acquisition. So I think that helped me understand what was going on and what should be going on, and not worry about things. So I did almost no homework in my classes. I didn't do any translation exercises. I didn't really do any flashcards for Mongolian. I just tried to do what I believed would be useful, which was get exposed to Mongolian as much as possible.
Yep.
And so that while we're there, I taught some Greek. I taught some Greek through Mongolian. That was fun. But the experience of learning a contemporary language in a fairly immersive environment, and then from the second year on, I was working and teaching in Mongolian. I think that shaped my overall perspective on how well CI can work, how quickly you can actually get reasonably proficient, and why that could be the case for Greek. Around that time, I also did a few classes with Michael Halcombe, who was running Conversational Koine Institute, which I think he's kind of shut down because he's doing other things, but he's still publishing stuff with Glosser House. That was really helpful. I mean, I was doing some other online class type things. It was helpful for me to see what he was doing, how he was teaching, because I wasn't really at a point where I had the confidence that I could teach communicatively. I knew I was getting there. I knew there wasn't that much that I needed to do in terms of a lot of comprehension, but I wasn't confident enough about teaching skills. So then kind of the last phase of this journey to where I am now is probably the last 4-ish years. We came back from Mongolia so I could finish off PhD. I started doing some Greek tutoring, Greek and Latin tutoring. And I started doing some kind of more conversational stuff online with people, video chats, both on a kind of a receiving end and a teaching end. I went to a couple of Salvi Latin immersion weeks, Rusticadios. That gave me an experience of kind of a full week speaking Latin. And just kind of those things got me to the point where I could say, okay, I can speak well enough that I can hold a conversation and I can lead someone else in a conversation. I can, on the teaching side, I can keep it all in the language. I certainly am not, I don't know where there is, but I'm still not there, but I know I've reached a point where I can hold proficient conversations with only minimal lapses. That's kind of where I'm at today.
Yeah, thanks. So if I'm hearing your story correctly, you kind of fell in with some of the CI stuff. You took through Lingua Latina Por Strada. You took a variety of classes, got into some Randall Booth stuff, and then had a variety of courses where you're just exposed to a lot of reading of text.
Yeah.
Would you say in those courses it was reading, but kind of like a guided reading?
Yeah, a lot of it's guided reading. I mean, even a lot of courses I've done have been traditional in format, in the sense that the course itself might be grammar translation based, but just the experience of reading a lot has just driven a lot of input. Some of those courses have been more communicative, and those are have been much more enjoyable and more useful.
Right.
Particularly the last year, I've been pretty ecstatic to have a couple of reading groups where I've read through Greek texts and discussed them and puzzled them out in Greek without any kind of external prep work or external English. Yeah.
Wow, that's fantastic. So I guess my other question, what methods do you think have helped you the most? You've kind of answered that. It's basically been lots of exposure and reading and chats and things like that.
Yeah. And this is part of the, what I was saying at the start, like I wouldn't tell people to do things the way I did them because it took too long to get where I am. And I think people can get there much faster if they're a bit smarter about what they spend their time on. So that's why, I don't tell people not to do flashcards, but I think there's better uses than flashcards for vocabulary. That is, in terms of your time invested in things. I think the best use of time is to be reading a lot, reading things that are relatively easy or not. If it's an intensive type of reading experience where you have to look up a lot of words, you're not getting as much exposure as you would by reading a lot of easy stuff. Conversation. There's not huge amounts of opportunities for conversation. Most of the people, most of my conversations now happen through video chat, either with friends or with students, or occasionally with more fluent speakers. Listening to audio is really helpful, but there's just not a lot of good Greek audio. So again, a lot of my Greek experience just leverages off what's going on in Latin, because the Latin community is larger and more active and so I spent a lot of time listening to Latin podcasts, which helped my ability not only to listen but also to speak tremendously. Far fewer things to listen to in Greek. Yeah, so far.
That's yep. So I think the answer is probably the same to the last question, but currently, from where you are now, what things do you do to try to keep pushing your current level farther?
Yeah. Partly it's driven by the vicissitudes of life.
Yes.
I don't have a time, I can't just sit around reading Greek all day, sadly. But there's enough going on, and a lot of my teaching is driven by where students are at, what they're doing, and so there's kind of enough of that going on at enough different levels that most of the time I'm reading Greek with different people at different levels in different kind of modes. Some of my students are in kind of fairly traditional programs and need to pass traditional exams, and so we work on that kind of stuff. And then for myself, just trying to make sure I'm reading things that interest me. I try and read a lot of easy stuff as well. Working through kind of different textbooks, different Greek readers, just to keep it light, keep it easy, but get more. And then a couple of there's a couple of conversation opportunities I have each week that keep me kind of speaking at a kind of a higher level. Yeah.
Okay. So just from my own experience, I think I'm probably the level that a lot of people are. They've made it through a year or two of Greek grammar. They're fairly comfortable with the aid of some tools to read it, to read New Testament texts. But it's fairly simple Koine, right?
Yeah.
So how do you get from, how would you say, so then when I go try to jump into something else, say the Apostolic Fathers, or another, or like classical texts like Anabasis or something, there's just so much vocabulary that's new. And even with the readers and things where you've got footnotes, it's like you're still having to look up so much stuff. How would you say for most people who maybe don't have the benefit of teachers like yourself or others, how do you get from New Testament to I can read? How do you handle the vocab problem?
I think you try and flatten the gradient as much as possible. That is one of the struggles, particularly for students who come out of a Koine background transitioning to broader text, is it seems much harder, and I think it probably is. Other texts are just tend to be written at a higher kind of literary register.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're trying to flatten that gradient as much as possible. And in one sense, the vocab problem never really goes away. Like I cannot read Homeric very well, because the vocabulary in Homer is quite different, and so um, just every second word I'm looking up and it's like, oh, this means X, but is a Homeric word for X. You probably know word Y. That kind of problem never necessarily goes away. So, I mean, apart from the readers and the Stedman, those kinds of things I think they're really useful. I think I tell people to cheat as much as they need to. That is, it's always fine to be looking stuff up or using whatever resources you can to make things as intelligible as quickly as possible. But in terms of the flattening the gradient kind of thing, it's a question of choosing, to the extent that you have the freedom, choosing texts that will make that gap as small as possible. So from the New Testament, going on to the Apostolic Fathers is probably still the easiest step. There's variation within the Apostolic Fathers, obviously. So something like Didache is pretty shares a lot of vocab with the New Testament already. But whereas things like some of 1 Clement, much more difficult. 2 Clement, a different kettle of fish again. And then, I mean, so, the Anabasis is a jump. It's a jump because the vocab is different, because it's talking about a whole bunch of different things.
Yeah.
One thing I tell people to do is try and be doing different things at different kind of levels. So if you're trying to breach that gap to, say, Anabasis, but it's intensive-ish kind of work, you're not able to do it kind of in a relaxed way. It's to say, okay, well, out of 10 units of Greek study I have, whatever those 10 units are, 10 minutes, 10 hours, whatever, some of it will be working at a more kind of difficult level, maybe 30%. But then I'm going to take some of the rest of the time and use it on something that's easier. Reading and rereading the New Testament, that kind of thing. So you're just, you're challenging yourself at some things, other things kind of in the middle, other things you're doing that are relatively easy but reinforcing your language. The other thing I do with students, and you can do it yourself as well, is just developing the ability to ask simple questions, to ask and answer simple questions. So you can talk about the text in language, who is this person? What are they doing? Where are they? Those very basic kind of having that question vocabulary, and then the ability to frame answers based out of what you're reading just really helps you kind of stay in the language with a text.
That makes sense. And when you read, would you recommend reading out loud?
Particularly for people who are kind of still beginners or have not done a lot of reading out loud, yes. I don't read it out loud a great deal, unless I'm with someone, just because it's much. I mean, people don't read out loud in general because it's slower, right? And It wears your voice out. But certainly early on, I think it's excellent, because you are. There's just a difference between reading silently and vocalizing, and the kind of the physical experience of just getting words out your mouth.
Yeah.
And if you can stand the sound of your own voice as well, reading aloud and recording, and having things to listen to when you are not able to do other things, can be useful.
True. Yeah, I'm working through Acts 10 for something, and I'd kind of done some pre-work through it, and then I have a recording of it that someone else did that I've listened to, and it's interesting how, having now read the text and worked through some of the vocab, listening to it, I can understand, machine gun speed a lot easier.
Yeah. The other thing I'll say is, if you can't stand the sound of your own voice, which is a common experience, if you can find a friend and exchange recordings so that you're listening to someone else, and then you're recording something that someone else can read, that's useful.
Yeah. Okay. It's a good idea. Yeah. So my other question was, what do you do for speaking and writing practice? But you've kind of mentioned that. I mean, you have your students. I know you're working on variety of projects where you're writing, and you've mentioned chat groups and things like that. So,
Yeah, and speaking of writing, are pretty different experiences.
yes.
I mean, I never did any kind of particular program to get where I am in terms of writing. Usually I can write fairly simple stuff without too much trouble, although writing for other people involves a lot of double checking, especially accents.
Accent marks?
Yeah, accent marks. Uh, but yeah, I would kind of encourage people to write, to try and start writing probably a lot earlier than they think they might, but just to keep it really simple. Just keep things simple and, target small and, write a sentence, write 2 sentences, take a passage and summarize it in a simpler way, things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that's really all the questions I have. It's nice to hear your story about how you got to where you are and some of your thoughts on how people would learn it. Do you have any projects you're working on that you're really excited about that you'd like to mention?
Yeah. So a couple of things. I'm working on a lot of things. Some things I'm working on more than others. So the Lingua Greca per se Illustrator project is something I'm really excited about. It's partly designed to do what Lingua Latina does, but partly not quite the same. And so it's essentially, I think of it as an open-ended writing project to create as much Greek text that flattens out the curve for anyone reading Koine or Attic to read interesting stories that introduce grammar and vocabulary gradually and give kind of meaningful, comprehensible repetition.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people, because of the name, think it's just going to be like a book and you'll read it and get to a certain point in Greek, like the Latin book. But really, I try and think of it as this kind of shared universe of Greek stories that people could read and contribute to. So I'm working away at that. Partly the writing part is interesting and challenging, but even the structuring part and kind of data going on behind it is also really kind of interesting stuff. Working out what do people need to learn, what do they need to be exposed to, that kind of thing. I was running a podcast, which is kind of on an unscheduled long hiatus, but I hope to get back to that as well to kind of produce more audio. Yeah.
Yeah, I've listened to various bits of the podcast while I've been running and jogging or whatever, and I definitely appreciate it. As someone who's both a learner and a teacher, it's nice hearing the stuff where we talk about pronunciation and some of the grammar and vocab stuff, because it gives me an idea how I might use that with my students. So yeah. I like that. Yeah, I guess that's really about it for me.
Sure. I mean, the last thing I was going to say, in terms of the question of how does CI shape what I do, I think there's this tendency for all kind of teachers and learners to think that we need to understand language in order to learn it. That's kind of what's driven, a grammar-based approach. That you need to understand language in order to learn it. And so, the reading in second language acquisition and understanding CI and what it's saying is, for me, it's kind of an anchor and a correction. There's a sense in which I enjoy grammar, I enjoy linguistics, I enjoy understanding how language works.
Yeah.
But knowing that and kind of being pretty convinced that acquisition happens when there's input and that input is understandable, kind of drags me back and says, what are you doing with your time and what are you doing with your students? There's a place for grammar and a place for explanation, but the bulk of what I should be doing, both as an ongoing learner, but also as a teacher, is getting input for myself and creating comprehensible input for others. That's what's going to drive acquisition. So it's kind of a corrective and an anchor for the rest of my activities.
Yeah, that makes sense. It is interesting. I mean, my interaction with the research boils down to, if I understand it correctly, saying find stuff you can understand, or that your students, that pushes them just a tiny little bit, and just
Yeah.
rinse repeat until they can do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, um, yeah. Well, again, thank you for your time. I'm gonna go ahead and kill the recording.
Yep.